Today, we are going to learn about API Gateway. We will learn about the basics of API Gateway. We will make resources, talk about path and query string parameters, connect our API to a Lambda function. We're going to see how to debug our API with CloudWatch, how to make resources. We will deploy our API so that when end users reach our defined endpoint, it will trigger our Lambda function to execute and make a dynamic response that will get sent back to our client and display it. And also everything will be explained in a beginner-friendly manner. So let's get started. Hey guys, so today I'll be giving you an introduction to Amazon API Gateway. So just before we start, what is an API? So an API, it's literally just an endpoint. All it is just like a middleman between a client's request and the server's response. So a client will send a request, and typically an API will take this request, and we can perhaps manipulate this request. Like the client request might be, okay, show me this video on this URL, and then the API will hear this request, and then maybe we can manipulate it. Maybe we'll just pass it as is to some backend resource. So this resource might be a database, a function, a piece of logic. There are several things that can receive our request. So let's say it's a function. Then the function will receive the request and all that information within it, and it'll process it and then send a response back to the API, and the API will send that, can again manipulate this response and send it, or pass it as is and then send it back to the client. So just I put this picture as an analogy. Like for some of you, it's kind of just like a waiter at a restaurant. Customer comes in, gives the order to the waiter, that's the request. The waiter will then forward this order to the chef. The chef is like the server that'll take this order, then process it and make your food, make your meal, and then send that meal back to the waiter. The waiter sends the response back to the client. And that, in this case, the waiter would be the API. It's just the middleman, it's the connection, it's the proxy, and that takes your request and takes the response between the client and the server. And this is another picture I found, which is pretty good. API, it's just the endpoint. So you can see it's kind of like a wall that's blocking, that's in between the server and the client. So that's all it is. Now, perhaps you might wonder why use an API. So APIs offer the big benefits are modularity and reusability, scalability, security, and support for microservice architecture. And let's get started with the demo now. I have this function and I'll give it to you as a zip file. So perhaps if you're really a beginner, I can just quickly show you how to make the function, just because you might be new to this. So I'll just call this function greet7 node.js, and let's create the function. Next, next you're gonna get this zip file that I'll offer to you guys. Now it's very simple. You just take this zip file, you click the upload zip file, upload, and then you just navigate to the zip file. And that's all. Now the function will be loaded. You can open index.js. Now let's just quickly walk through this function. So this is going to be the logic, guys. It's going to work like this. So if we go back to this picture, we're going to get a request, then API gateway will forward that request to our Lambda function. Our Lambda function will take the request, do the logic that we've written here, and then send a response back to API gateway and to then forward that response back to the client. So before we start API gateway, let's just take a quick second to understand what's going on in this function. So there's a couple things. So we can see that it's just a very simple greeting function. So based off of, when the way it works is this function gets triggered by a certain event. So if you don't know anything about Lambda functions, guys, just to briefly tell you, we can trigger functions to happen on an event, and when that event happens, our function gets passed an event object which will contain certain information, and this information is what we will use in our Lambda function and process to do whatever we wish. So you might be wondering, what event is going to trigger our Lambda function? So you can easily see that here, guys. That's why. So we can just call this event test1, and the event we are going to be working with is this event called API Gateway AWS Proxy. So this is all the information that's going to get passed to our function. So when an endpoint that we define in API Gateway gets hit, and it's going to be proxy, which basically means we don't modify the request at all. We send it as is, no modification happens, our Lambda function will happen. And I want you to pay attention to two pieces of information, that'll get passed: query string parameter and path parameter. Now you're going to hear this quite a lot, and you should know what these two things mean. And I think this picture here illustrates really well what is a query string parameter and what is a path parameter. So as you can see, this part, this library/book, is the query string parameter, and these other parts, question, location equals Toronto, and title equals Ulysses, is query string. So just briefly, a path parameter is just parts of the URL that are used to identify a specific resource. So in this example, when we go to the library page, but there might be so many things that we can see in the library: movies, CDs, books, and magazines. So the book part lets us pass more information, telling us we want to know about the books in this library to our backend resource. And then the query string parameters are just key value pairs. So the key is just the subject of interest. So it's like the location is the key, or title is the key, and the value is Toronto or Ulysses. So it's a key and value pair to pass even more information to our backend function. Like here, we want to see books in the library, and the books we want to see are in the location Toronto with the title Ulysses. So that's all that means when we see the word key value pair, and you're going to see that more in our example. So the path parameter in this case so for now I'll just save this while I walk through our function. So we're going to get passed an event, and from the path parameter object, we're going to take a path parameter called name. And from the query string parameters, there's going to be a query string called lang, and then we use destructuring here. And if you don't know JavaScript, all destructuring is it's kind of like, I told you guys, these are key value pairs. So if you don't know what key value pair is, just search up a picture, and it's Guys, key value pairs are really just as simple as this. The key, and then there's a value. It's like, it's not that complicated. So all destructuring does is it lets us, from key value pairs, it just lets us take the single value that we want from the key value pair. So in this case, there will be a value called a key called lang, and we're going to take that key and put it in a variable, the key lang in our query string parameters, and put it in our variable lang. And this ... info is going to be an array. And all the other key value pairs in our query string parameters will go into this array. So you're going to see in a moment. And then we just make a response. And then this is just a quick piece of logic where basically if the lang variable has a value en, then we say hello. If it has fr for French, and we say bonjour, hi for Hindi, namaste, and those all go into our message variable. And that's how we make our message. So it's, and then we just append the name. So if the name is Joe and they write ES, it'll say hola Joe. And then we just make a response object, which will hold our response. And then all we do is we just return our response object with the status code and the response. So I'll just show you a quick test. So we're going to configure this test event. So I told you it's looking for the two things, path parameter and query string parameter. So it's looking for a path parameter called name. So we need to add a name here. So in this case, I'll just add a name and we'll just say Joe. And for query string parameter, we're going to add a query string parameter, and it's looking for the one called lang. And we'll put hi for Hindi, and we'll just put one more. We'll just say age is 20, and we'll just put location as Brazil. Now you'll see what I mean. So let's test this, and you're gonna see. So it says Namaste Joe, and I told you the info is an array. So you see this, it's an array. So it has three things: is foo, which was the default there, age, and location. And oh yeah, you might wonder, what is this moment library? It's just to create a timestamp, not that important. So that's just an overview of this function and this logic. I hope you understand. Now let's move on to the API part, the reason you clicked this. So let's go ahead and make a new API. Let's go ahead and make a new API. Create API now. Let's make a REST API, and I hope you know what this means, but what is REST stand for? Representational State Transfer. And now you might be like, oh, what does that mean? So all this is, guys, is, you can just ignore this. Okay, all REST means is it's just the standard that we use in order to engage in communication between client and server. So it's just the way we talk. It's just the set of rules that we use to talk between each other. So it outlines so representational stateless transfer basically means, like, stateless means that we transmit all information. We don't expect either side to the server to hold the state of our conversation. And it outlines all the different methods, the way we can talk to each other, like get, post, put, delete, options. It's just to simplify, it's the way that, it's the rules that outline how client and server talks to each other. So we're gonna make a new API. We're gonna just call this API whatever greeting and continue. Oh, I lost internet. Okay, I lost internet. I have to make my API again. We'll just call it greeting. Create API. Okay, I call it greetung. Anyway, so let's create a resource. We'll just call our resource greet. And now guys, remember back to that point where I was talking about path parameters. Path parameters just help us specify, give a further specification to which part of the resource we are looking for. So under greeting, we're going to create another resource and it'll be called name. So this is how we're going to pass our name to our Lambda function. Our Lambda function is going to be looking for a path parameter, and the way we specify path parameters under a certain endpoint is like this, by wrapping it under these in these curly braces. So we will create that, and under name we'll now create a GET request. So we hit this endpoint. Now when we hit this endpoint, we need to tell API Gateway, oh, what do we do when they hit the greet and the name? So we hit the greet endpoint and they gave the name Joe. Now what happens if we get a GET request or a POST request or a PUT request? So all these different things can happen at an endpoint. You can get any one of these requests at an endpoint, and we need to program what happens based off of a certain request. So we can get a GET request, and we can pick which Lambda function we want to execute. So the greet7, and we're going to select Lambda proxy integration. And again, all that means is our request gets passed from the client straight to our Lambda function with no intermediate manipulation. Create the method. Now we've created the method, so we can go ahead and test our method. So we can put Joe and test, and we got an internal server error. So now you might be wondering, what happened? Well, I did this on purpose, guys. I tricked you. So all we need is, I didn't trick you, I promise. All we need is, I wanted to just show you how we can debug. And always, guys, always go to CloudWatch. This is where everything is logged. So in CloudWatch we can go to our log groups, and you're gonna find your Lambda function. So greet7, the one we just made, you're gonna see, and you can find the error. Cannot destructure property lang as it is null. So basically it's trying to get a value for this, and that value doesn't exist because in here I didn't pass a query parameter. So just to quickly work around this, we'll just set this equal to, it can be whatever's in here, or it can just be a null value. So like an empty value, not a null value. So we'll redeploy this, and we'll now test this again. And there, hello Joe, our default, because we default to English, our default response. And then here we can put lang equals in the, and then it says Namaste Joe, and we can add some more details, and location equals wherever, Australia, and age equals 200, and you see it went into the info array, and there's the timestamp, and here's this. So now you're like, wait, but how am I going to use this in my application? How can I use this for the world to see? So we can just quickly deploy this API. We need to pick a stage, which is basically the environment in which our API will reside. We can just make a new stage, hit deploy, and now we are given a URL to invoke our GET request. So here we can copy this, and we can replace this with a name, John, and here we get a response to my client, hello John. If I change it to Bill, and lang equals Spanish, it becomes hola Bill. And if we go to our greet 7 lambda, we see more logs. So here at 10:02, 10:03, so it keeps updating. So again, if I do another one, add another query string parameter, location equals wherever, India, it got added to our info, and our CloudWatch will get updated again. Right now, see even more logs. So you can see our Lambda function is getting executed, and we deployed an API, and that is your introduction to API Gateway. Thank you, and please subscribe.